morning sun, flying high in the sky till the day is done. I can't break away. Like a child in his fantasy, punching holes in the walls of reality. All my life I wanted to fly, but I don't have the wings, and I wonder why I can't break away. Oh, well, Mama told me when I was young, stand tall, girl, you're never born. But you can be what you wanna be, but you can't change the course of your destiny. I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. Well, I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. Ooh, I can't break away.
Greetings, my excellent friend.
Yeah, you did. And it says anonymous, but it also says it at the top of my screen who did it. So thank you very much for the 10 gift subs, Manny on the way in, as well as Terry, 23 months tier 1, Gilly, 24 months tier 1. Welcome into the penultimate episode of Fixer's Heavy Metal History Season 1, as we are, including tonight, 2 episodes away from the end, and next Saturday will be our finale and our setup of Napoleon Bonaparte taking over the reins of control in France. Before we get going tonight, in what is going to be a very disjointed episode, because that is what the spring into the summer of 1799 is, I did want to take a minute to say first, Happy Father's Day to everybody out there who's a dad. Being a father is a pretty thankless job. Doesn't get as much of a great rap as being a mom does, and that's fine. But as all of you know, I had a pretty good scare with my dad this spring, and spent the day with him today instead of tomorrow doing just some stuff. He basically needed stuff lifted. And don't take your dad for granted. I've committed myself to spending more time with both of my parents in the wake of everything that happened with my dad in April, and he's doing great. But it could have easily been very different. So I know my dad on occasion catches these episodes, so does my mom on YouTube. So I just wanted to say to my dad, I love you very much. And to everyone else, just don't take the idea that your parents are going to be there forever for granted, because I got a real big awakening with that this spring. So don't just pay it lip service tomorrow. Make sure that you go out there and you spend some time with your dad if you have that opportunity. But here we are. We are near the end of things. And the layout where we go from here is I still have to write the last episode, which I plan to spend a majority of my day tomorrow doing. What I did instead, since I got this episode done this week, was I had also mentioned that we would have some sort of some summary finale. Well, that's now taking place in the form of a video. So next week there will be a video, a retrospective video, that kind of takes us from where we started to where we are going to leave things off at the end of next Saturday. Taking that all situations aren't the same, but again, if the situation correctly merits it, make sure you give both of your parents the attention they deserve. And for those of you that don't know, I've also been working on a couple of projects. One of them you can see over my head right now if I move out of the way. Right there is now my shadow box. That is all of my challenge coins and ribbons and whatnot. And then up there is a wooden American flag that a young man who was adopted and then brought to the United States and then learned about who I was and kind of what I had done. And he now basically, I don't know, considers me a hero or something. But he made that for me, and it was the first gift a civilian had ever given me, and thanks for my military service. So it sits on top of that shadow box. But the other thing, on the topic of my mom, is I've been working on getting a new flight jacket done. And I've been posting pictures of that in the Discord, but today she really outdid herself. I was really expecting this pretty major back patch that I have on this jacket to, just let's put it on there, just get it sewn. She took the patch, she did amazing things without a ruler, to be very, very clear. She took the seams, folded in half like a seamstress would do, found the center edge of the back of the jacket, aligned everything correctly, pinned it down, but left room so she could get her hand in, and then made sure that the nylon that's underneath this patch was not folded or crinkled or wrinkled in any way. And it's just absolutely, I was blown away. And the amount, like, me and my dad were gone for maybe 45 minutes. I come back, it's done. And I looked at it, and I was like, it's a skill that most people don't have. And my mom, just because she's very proud of me, just did it. And I looked at it, and it was perfect. So, in any event, I'll stop waxing about my parents and everything. But just, again, don't take your parents for granted. Especially, if they've been good there for you. I feel very beholden to my parents that, honor bound to make sure that I take care of them like they took care of me. But here we are. Episode 1.44. This will be our penultimate episode on our cycle of the French Revolution.
My lord, go f*** yourself!
This will be our penultimate episode on our cycle of the French Revolution, which began in May of 2021. And I was going through the statistics of everything around the work done, and Gilly said something in his stream, I believe 2 nights ago, that was very appreciative of it. And I wanted to make sure that I do this as well, because I've been told by people to do this. This project started in 2018 as we were watching some people play some video games that had some historical bent. And I started commenting on things because I have been a student of history for a long time. And the sentiment started to come across from people, you should do something, you should produce something that is historical. And I took that advice to heart, and as has been mentioned in this series, I wanted to figure out where to start. And it took about a month after that conversation started, and I wanted to teach how we got to our modern world, the world we all live in today, and how history really has built that world for us. And I went back in time, I was like, what's the defining thing of our age? And really, one of the major defining things is the military-industrial complex that the United States is. It defines the West. And I sat there and went back and it's like, where does that have its origin? And it was the levée en masse during the Reign of Terror that Lazare Carnot formulated to build out the French army. The mass industrialization of an entire state for a war purpose is the first time in history it happened. And I was talking to my father about this today because he asked me these questions. And if you go back and look at the American Revolution, it was an order of thousands facing thousands in battles. And as the French Revolution has gone on, we're talking about tens of thousands facing tens of thousands, and in some instances, hundreds of thousands of troops are on the field. And that's a major difference in a period of 20 years. So once I identified that was the start point for what I wanted to talk about, well, I can't just jump into the middle of the levée en masse. There was no context there. So I spent 2 years. All the sources that were there when we started, it was about 22 sources that were in there, like de Tocqueville and many, many other authors. I spent 2 years reading that so that I could piece this together in an unbiased way and then present to you what I knew to be fact, and then present my opinion on things. And I've hopefully done a decent job saying, this is what I think at times when I'm kind of going into speculation or subjective land, and staying very firm on facts when I know them to be facts. So that process took 2 years, and about, I would say, 6 months before May 2021, I felt like I was in a position to really start talking about this. And I started putting out some teasers that this was actually going to happen, and people didn't believe me. So the weekly process, before we get into tonight's episode, is usually on a Monday. I have a a written outline of key events, like events I must jump between. And I effectively begin by writing around what I know to be my hurdle that week, what I must clear. And I try to keep the focus along as few lines as possible, because especially in this thing, the French Revolution, there are just threads everywhere. But the process of writing an episode is complex. It takes me about 6 to 10 hours to write the episode. So I'm typing and thinking and going and looking things up again because I want to make sure that I'm correct and referring to notes I've taken. And the outline becomes a script at about, I would say on average, 8 hours. And that script averages between 12 and 15 pages. Once that's done, I actually take, and for those of you that have been looking at my notes now that they're available, I bold out names, I bold out geographic locations, because then I have to take that and I have to build what's in front of you, which is this whiteboard, because we determined very early that seeing things was very conducive to everyone retaining everything. The build of all the people on the whiteboard's pretty quick. It takes me about maybe an hour to get them all in. The maps, though, this week's map is a custom map. That map took me the better part of 3 hours to make. And then Gilly was shocked in the second episode of this season when I said, I'm redoing the intro every time. Now I have a template for that, but it still has to be done and then has to be rendered. So you're talking on average between, there's 8 plus the hour to get the whiteboard done, plus maybe another hour to 3 hours. So you're talking between 11 and 14 hours a week I put into every episode. And then look at it from a broad perspective. By the time we're done here, there will be over 112 spoken hours of content that is not for any purpose but educational. And there will be over 608 pages, that's basing off of averages as I go into the last week, over 608 pages written in this series. And it is a body of work. So I respect the fact that everyone's come along with me on this ride. We'll have a little bit more on the retrospective next week on a lot of these things. But it did hit me that, yeah, I've kind of fallen into a rhythm and I'm really good at producing what I'm producing. But when you stack one on top of another, it's been almost 3.5 years of educational effort to get this out to you guys. So the fact that there are people here every week that are interested in this, that want to see what I've put together, really means a lot to me. And that's the work. So I appreciate those who are appreciative. I appreciate those who are saying, it's more than just a history show, because it is. And it is a significant portion of my life over the past 3 years that has gone into producing this series, which we all originally told you would take 15 episodes and is now 3 times that long. But again, this episode tonight is our penultimate episode on the cycle of the French Revolution. It will take us through the autumn of 1799, and it will set up the looming coup of Brumaire that I've been hinting about, that will represent the end of Season 1 of Fixer's Heavy Metal History. After our next episode brings Napoleon Bonaparte to power, we will take a pause of about 6, maybe 7 weeks. I need to go back and reread a couple of things still and reformat how I want to go at Napoleon and produce that outline. I won't be not doing stuff. I just need to get everything in order again. And then we'll start our journey in Season 2. And that journey will start with a look back. We'll have hey, this is how we got here. And that's more for my YouTube audience to say, if you're just starting with Napoleon, here's the story so far. And then we'll take a look forward into the Napoleonic era by trying to make sense of the consulate, which is something you're going to hear about more next week. And make sense of this just complicated decade plus that we've been through and we've traversed together for over a year. So when we last left things off last week, 21 minutes into my stream, we left the Directory declaring war on Austria in March 1799, which officially started this War of the Second Coalition. Now, for the at war with France at the top, I'm actually going to go ahead and take the United States back off, because they're going to fall off in terms of relevance. They had been fighting their quasi-war in the Caribbean against the French, but not coordinating with the British But we're now in a position where we're talking about the actual coalition again. So I do not want people to be confused about what exactly is going on. So we're going to take the American flag down. We're going to move the Austrians back over into that fold. And now we're just looking again at the nations who are fighting in Europe against France. And Dustin is easily confused for sure. Welcome in, Dustin. So despite this new coalition now containing the Russians and the Ottomans, and I'm going to click off that flag so it doesn't look obnoxious, the Directory, actually inside the halls of the Directory, they felt pretty good. They felt pretty good about their chances. Even though, General Jourdan is out there coming back with reports from the fronts repeatedly warning the Directory over the winter of 1798, 1799, that, the armies that were set to defend Italy and Switzerland and the Rhineland were just not in good shape. They were undermanned and undersupplied. The Directory looked at that and said, we still feel pretty good. It's simply that they had gotten used to beating up on the old European powers, and they had been doing that for a couple of years now, and Napoleon really helped them with that. But you have to understand that the levy en masse was not permanent. The levy en masse had been allowed to basically expire at the end of the war, because now we're only fighting Britain. So the mass industrialization that had been this engine that had driven the French war machine had been allowed to stop and maybe rust a little bit. Yeah, they being Napoleon, indeed. So the situation for the French really hadn't improved by the spring of 1799. Recall from last episode that they had 200,000 men were supposed to have been conscripted under that Jourdan law, but in that first wave, only about 74,000 had actually made it to the front in that, first initial wave, and then some replacements and volunteers were accepted after that law was amended. But they didn't have the troop strength that they thought they had on paper for sure, and those troops were being brought in a system that was not a levy en masse system, was not an amalgame system. So the things that were the strength of the French army had been allowed to fall off, and the Directory just assumed that, we'll just keep winning now. So for the campaigns of 1799, the French had organized a new army of about 45,000 men, which they dubbed the Army of the Danube. And they put it under command of the now on-again and incredibly nervous General Jourdan. Down in Italy, there were close to 100,000 French troops, but they were literally scattered all over the peninsula. Part of that is because Napoleon has spent his time, this is the one thing he didn't do right in Italy, scattering his troops all over Italy to hold all of these places that he had stood up as new political entities. But in anticipation of hostilities, 45,000 of those French troops were stationed on, it is a lot, 45,000 of those French troops were stationed along the Adige River. And I'm going to draw where the Adige is right now. It basically runs right by Verona. The Adige River runs right there. Just so that you know what I'm talking about when I say Adige a bunch of times tonight. So about 45,000 troops were stationed, French troops were stationed at the Adige River. This is the border, effectively, between the Cisalpine Republic and now Austrian-controlled Venice. Arrayed against the French in the spring of 1799 were about 75,000 Austrians in southern Germany under Archduke Charles. Guess who's back? Back again. 60,000 Allied troops are on the other side of the Adige in Venice, and there are another 20,000 Allied troops guarding the Alpine passes in and out of Austrian territory. So there's 74,000 men that were brought in, 45,000 men kind of make it into the Army of the Danube, and there's another 45,000 men that are on the French side of the Adige. So that's 90,000 men. The Allies are bringing far more men than that against them. But the new key ingredient here for the campaigns against the French in 1799 will be the arrival of the Russians. Tsar Paul I, who was much more all about going after France, had promised an additional 60,000 men to fight the frenzied French Republic, and he was keeping that promise. These Russian troops, you'll remember, had been massing.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
In Austrian territory all winter. That was the casus belli, the reason for war for the French, was what are those Russians doing there? Get them out of here. And the Austrians looked and said, no, we kind of like our chances. But they had been moving into Austria all winter, preparing to move with the Austrians into Italy and Switzerland. And one of the Austrians' conditions for joining forces, these are not independent armies, and that's the big thing here, is remember, combining forces and coordinated action has always been a problem for the Austrians. That's why Napoleon was able to beat them so many times at Mantua. One of the Austrian conditions for joining forces, and I mean really join forces, combine forces with the Austrians, was that the Russians also include their legendary general, Alexander Suvorov, to be the overall commander-in-chief of the combined force. Now, that means you have effectively a force under the command of Archduke Charles up in, the Rhineland, and you have this combined Austrian-Russian force that's going to plunge into Italy, that's going to be under the command of Alexander Suvorov. Suvorov's an interesting guy, but we're not going to go into his biography here because it's not relevant. He was, at this point in history, pushing about 70 years old. But over the course of his life for the Russians, now this is a Russian army that had been fighting fighting the Turks for a long time. Suvorov had won over 60 major battles, and there is not a recorded defeat of him. Prior to this point in history, not once. So you kind of get why the Austrians send that unbeatable guy. Because the French unbeatable guy, he's not here right now, but I'm pretty sure once this gets started, he's going to be back. We need an unbeatable guy as well. And the Russians agreed, and Suvorov is a part of the package deal that comes down out of Russia to fight with the Austrians. Well, here's the thing. The Russian army is not bad. The Russian army is good. And this period in time, the Russian army is good. And I would argue that the Russian infantry is forever good. It's the Russian mechanized warfare as we turn into the 20th century that isn't so awesome. Their failure to modernize because they were this massive gargantuan. We're going to get into all that as we approach the Russo-Japanese War, as we turn the page in the 20th century, 8,526 episodes from now. But this Russian army is not a bad army. It's an infantry-focused army, and it's very good. Yeah, they have two anti-Napoleons to a degree, Archduke Charles and Suvorov. But I've mentioned this thing called the Marshals a few times, the French Marshals, and I've been naming them as dropping breadcrumbs for you for over 20 episodes. Napoleon's not the only gifted French commander either, and I'm actually going to introduce a couple more of his marshals this evening. But Suvorov, by 1799, was pretty much a mythical living legend in his own time. And age has not diminished his skills. He is very soon, in tonight's episode, going to be pushing the French completely out of Italy and totally undoing everything that Bonaparte did. But the French Directory decided that it was best to strike first, before the Russians could really get into the fight. And that's a common theme in European military strategy from now until the end of World War I. Get to the fighting before the Russians can get everything going. Because, again, the Russians are a gifted infantry army, but it's a massive infantry army. And the logistics of getting people from Russia into Central Europe is not easy. World War I's predicated on this from the Germans' perspective when they try to knock France out before the Russians can completely mobilize. The French are doing that here. They want to bang the Austrians before the Russians can really, really get things going. So, in early March 1799, they ordered General Jourdan, the Directory did. They said, you take your army of the Danube and cross the Rhine at a crossing near Basel, which is right where the Rhine begins to turn east. And Basel is on the upper portion. I've tried to make the town and place names very, very visible for you guys on that map tonight so we don't have to zoom completely in all the time. But the plan for Jourdan was to cross at Basel and then attack the positions for the Austrians on the Swiss plateau. Now, the Swiss plateau sounds like a weird thing, but it's actually a flatter piece of land that exists between the Rhine River to the south, where Jourdan just crossed, and the Danube River to its north. And the objective of this offensive for Jourdan was to win firm control of all of these Alpine passes between German lands and Italy, as Germany and Italy were bound to be the two main theaters of war, and the French wanted to be sure that their enemies were separated, that they couldn't link up, that especially Archduke Charles and the Austrian force to the south could not combine. With the Swiss Helvetic Republic garrisoned by another 20,000 French troops, it looked like a decent bet to the Directory that, on paper, this position inside Switzerland was going to be the central position, the central strategic position. They could lash out to the north, they could lash out to the south. The problem is, fighting to the north never manifested. The whole, let's fight along the Rhine, along all those little principality states, has been the common theme for the French and the Austrians for every time they fought the war. That doesn't manifest this time. So, the Helvetic Republic position doesn't turn out to be central. Most of the fighting actually is going to happen in Italy in this first phase. And as has been the case for General Jourdan, every single time he has crossed a river called the Rhine, it's not going to go well for him. And it's really like if this were ancient times, there would like have been a curse written into this guy's background. Some prophecy by some oracle that, Jourdan was cursed to never win beyond the Rhine, because to this point he has failed to do so, and he's about to fail to do so again. Jourdan should adjust to him. The thing is Jourdan's not a bad commander. He's been a victim of circumstances, and remember, Moreau's the guy that didn't link up with him. Yeah, but he probably thinks the river itself is cursed. It's that historically bad for him. So Jourdan took 35,000 of his men northeast out of Basel and onto the plains of Ostrach, which is on the north edge of the Swiss plateau, kind of by the Danube. And he thought that up on this high ground, highly advantageous position. But when he got there, it turned out that the ground was very muddy. And armies, especially before the era of mechanized, warfare under engines driving tank treads, is really, really bad. It's really, really bad even whenever the tanks are moving. But it was muddy. Really muddy. And then there was a very, very thick early spring fog. So you have a guy who is now on this high plateau in a decent strategic position, tactical position, to fight against somebody. But he can't see anything, and he's not in a position to move his army very quickly. Just order the troops to punish the river like other historical figures. If you want to talk about a river that got punished historically, look at the Tiber, which is the river that runs by Rome. Yeah, it's like he's intentionally placed himself in a box. I would say unintentionally placed himself in a box. The position itself, when you look at a topographical map, looks great. But when you get there, and you can't make an effective camp, and you can't really marshal your army very well to wheel it in any direction because it's just stuck in the mud, and then you can't see where your enemy is, that's a problem. Not only did the ground here make it very hard to maneuver, the fog's the big thing, because it shrouded the size of Archduke Charles's army. Jourdan did not realize, with his force of 35,000, that 52,000 Austrians were coming to meet him, and that Archduke Charles had another 25,000 in extremely close reserve. So the two armies came together on March 20th, 1799, and, as you would expect, the Austrians' significant numerical advantage, and under the command of a good commander, proves to be decisive here. And so Jourdan and his army had to retreat back up to some higher ground, and they planned to counterattack against Archduke Charles the next day. But by then, this spring fog had lifted, and Jourdan, looking down, got a really good look at, holy crap, they outnumber us better than 2-1. That's a really big army, much bigger than I thought it was when I took this position here. And because he had already taken pretty heavy casualties that first day, Jourdan withdrew entirely to the west. And then a few days later, on March 25th, the Austrians caught up with him it's a really hard word to pronounce, Stockach, where Jourdan tried to tighten up his lines and take advantage of the fact that the Austrians had spread them out spread their army out pretty wide, trying to kind of cast a net around Jourdan. And because of that, the French almost were able to flank around Archduke Charles, but that flanking attempt, which was the key element of the Battle of Stockach, was a failure by Jourdan, and Jourdan realized he had been beaten again, and then he makes a critical decision. He retreats northwest into the Black Forest. The Black Forest in German lands has been mythical for forever, and it's a great place to hide an army. So I get the basic premise of why Jourdan said, let's get out of here, let's get off the Swiss plateau, let's get the army to a position where it can reconstitute. But the question is, why didn't he retreat back into the Helvetic Republic, where there were 20,000 additional troops there and Alpine passes, which would have made it difficult for Archduke Charles to simply plunge into Switzerland? You have a bad feeling on the Black Forest decision. It doesn't turn out to be bad for Jourdan or the troops there. It turns out to be bad for France overall. So though he had Jourdan on the run, Archduke Charles didn't pursue him. He decided to call a halt right there. I've pushed the major force out of the Swiss plateau. I'm going to wait for whatever reinforcements the Russians are going to send me. And then we're going to do what Jourdan should be doing here, is link up. And then we're going to plunge into Switzerland, because that was one of their strategic war aims, was to push the French out of Switzerland. So Jourdan, in this decision, left Switzerland isolated. Maybe he was hoping to let his reserve forces flank Charles as Jourdan was being pursued. I don't think so. I think Jourdan had had enough, and you'll see why in a second. But down the road, with relation to this decision, Napoleon Bonaparte's pretty critical of Jourdan in this moment. And again, this is someone who Napoleon will eventually trust pretty decently with military forces. But he's really critical of Jourdan in this opening phase of the war as well. And if Napoleon's critical, regardless of anything else you think about him, if he's critical of a tactical decision, I tend to give that a tremendous amount of weight. Because the Battle of the Black Forest, or not the Battle of the Black Forest, but the retreat into the Black Forest, instead of retreating into Switzerland to link up with those 20,000 men, just leaves with Switzerland completely wide open. And you'll see coming out of Stockach that red arrow. That is Charles. He's going to plunge into Switzerland towards Zurich, and there's going to be very little in front of him because of Jourdan's decision to go into the Black Forest instead of retreat back the way I came, which would have been the better decision. The decision here by Jourdan simply divides the French forces around the Rhine. It makes the defense of Switzerland pretty impossible. But Jourdan, once he had gotten his army clear and gotten into the Black Forest, he himself decided, I'm going to go back to Paris to complain about the terribly unprepared army that the Directory had just sent him. And then he requested medical leave. Like, oh, I'm not feeling too good either after all the fighting, which the Directory quickly granted because, again, Jourdan, we've said, on again, off again, on again, off again, now again, off. He's no longer in command of the army of the Danube. We're going to leave them in the Black Forest for now. And Jourdan's basically going, I'm done with this. I told you guys that this war was a bad idea, that the army was not ready for this fight. And is there any recording of whether he was actually injured or ill? No, but these commanders would, as Napoleon did, you'll remember, feign illness to avoid being posted to a place they didn't want to be. And it's actually one of the reasons Napoleon was available to turn back the royalist coup. But meanwhile, down in Italy, things are not going to go any better. This entire episode is about things not really going great for the French army. The army of Italy was now led by a man named General Barthélemy Scherer, and he is the guy in the bottom row right next to Jourdan, who's bottom left corner. And Scherer was an old professional soldier who had actually served in his past in both, and this is going to be important in a little bit, who had actually served in his past in both the Austrian and Dutch armies before the revolution had broken out. But he has been a mainstay of the French army pretty much ever since the reforms that got merit-based promotion going in the French army. Since those things happened, he's been a mainstay for most of the decade in the French army. And I didn't mention it at the time, but Scherer is the guy who Bonaparte replaced as commander of the Army of Italy back in 1796 when he was sent down there and took this ragtag, really wasn't in the greatest shape force and turned him into the best army in France. Scherer also has a little bit of history here. He was appointed Minister of War in that whole great ministerial reshuffle, which had also brought Talleyrand to power back during the build-up to the coup of Fructidor. Remember when Hoche was given that position, and then Hoche said, I don't want any part about what's about to go down. Scherer was his replacement as Minister of War, as they reshuffled people around and sent Napoleon down to replace Scherer. But as the War of the Second Coalition approached, Scherer was sent back to take control of the Army of Italy, because there's no Napoleon there anymore, where he would prove himself to be no Bonaparte. And soon General Scherer would be requesting to someone to take over his army, just like General Jourdan had just done. So the boundary between the French-controlled Cisalpine Republic and the Austrian-controlled Venetian Republic, again, was essentially the Adige River, which I drew in red earlier. The Austrians they did control a couple of towns on the western bank, but the most important town in this entire scenario around the Adige is Verona. So just as General Jourdan was, trying to jump the Austrians before the Russians got there, that's exactly what General Scherer was trying to do at Verona as well. And in mid-March 1799, he advanced with about 46,000 men and the intention of first expelling the Austrians from Verona, take control completely of the Adige River, and then use Verona as a base to advance still further east and kind of hold the Austrian-Russian combined force at bay. But he never got past step one. And in fact, he'll be very quickly retreating back to the west in a very, very demoralized and poorly thought out rush. But as for step one, Scherer advanced in 3 columns. And I thought about drawing all these out, but it was like, no, he's just going to Verona. There's 3 towns. There's one to the north, one to the south, but Verona is the focal point here. He advanced with 3 columns. His left and right columns attacked the cities of Pestrengo and Legnano, which were above and below Verona, respectively, while his center and core drove directly at Verona. The cities, all 3 of these cities' towns, were all held by a combined Austrian army of about 41,000 at the time. And on March 26th, the French engaged all these towns simultaneously, and they took Pestrengo. But they were repulsed and pushed back at Legnano. And the fight in Verona was just a bloody draw. So you have the French advancing north, being held in the middle, and honestly being pushed a little bit back in the south. This was a pretty inconclusive first round of fighting, but it was just a prelude to the much more disastrous second round that's about to happen. On April 5th, about a week and a half later, the French massed south of Verona and then just marched straight north. But this happened to be the time that the Austrians were marching out of Verona straight south to go find the French army. These 2 armies ran into each other south of Verona in a driving rainstorm at the small town of Magnano. And the resulting Battle of Magnano, Scherer deployed his forces along a very wide front. And the idea of spreading forces versus concentrating forces is not as simple as one always works and one always doesn't. It's a matter of what your enemy does and what the terrain looks like. But in this instance, Scherer decided to deploy himself very widely. And in this case, Rocket's right. It will be spread too thin. But the right wing of this very widely spread line almost, again, just like Jourdan, almost turned the flank of the Allied army it was facing. But it was too spread out by that time. And the other really critical thing is Scherer had spread his line out very wide without holding a reserve. So he had no ability to plug holes or reinforce problem areas as they manifested during the fight. And as a result, the Austrians were able to basically let that French right wing march out too far from the main line, and then they just went right at, like a guy named Napoleon had taught them to do, right at that center point and cut it in half and left the French right wing out there without anywhere to go. So Scherer goes, oh crap, recognizes this, and orders a general retreat, including that now isolated right wing. And this is the really critical thing. Scherer should have done this. He should have withdrawn to the next defensible river, right along here. He should have probably retreated back this way, but he doesn't. He retreats effectively 100 miles to this dot, 100 miles or so southeast of Milan. This is really important that he does it. So this is another strategic decision that's not good by the French commanders. He brings himself he gives up about 150 miles of territory to the Austrian Allied army just because. You know, he could have defended himself at the next river. He chose not to. But he also leaves every little town along the way that has a French garrison of a couple thousand holding the little citadel of each city isolated, just like that garrison in Mainz had been. And so he's leaving breadcrumbs of forces that have no way to defend themselves as he abandons them to an Austrian advance while he brings himself all the way back to Milan. The really critical thing here is this withdrawal from Verona back to basically Milan also includes the fortress at Mantua, which Napoleon had defended 4 times. Basically sieged 4 times, defended from an attack 4 times, but it leaves Mantua wide open to an Allied siege again. And that fortress at Mantua was a big fortress. It's important. We've talked about its strategic significance several times, but it was still only 12,000 men. And this is an Austrian force that's basically about to be reinforced by the Russians as it advances across the Adige and back into Italy. I wonder if any of these people realize that hundreds of years later, people will be sitting around to armchair quarterback their strategies. These decisions are bonehead decisions, to be very honest. I think that they were both ultimately self-serving decisions by the commanding general, not done in the interest of France, but done in the interest of one's own skin and sanity. So we have Scherer now. So you can focus more down on the bottom of the map because that's where the rest of the conversation is going to be tonight, except for one little thing with Messina and near Zurich. But you have Scherer, who's now pulled himself back basically to Milan, surrendered all this land, especially Mantua, that Napoleon had worked his butt off very brilliantly to capture for France. And every little place that I could draw a dot on in between Verona and Milan that simply has, 1,500, 1,200, 3,000, 6,000 French troops to hold that position while we run away from the problem. And all these places are going to get overrun. And it's just drip, 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 drip from the French army that there's no levée en masse in place right now. They cannot afford to lose seasoned troops. Remember, these are troops that are of the army of Italy. They're part of the force that Napoleon hardened. You're taking some of your best troops and just leaving them to the wind. Scherer handles everything incorrectly here. But this run of defeats then convinced General Scherer that he was in over his head. That part's right. And he basically had lost all confidence in himself. And that's never something you want your commanding general to not have, is he didn't believe in Scherer anymore. He didn't believe in his own ability to salvage this situation. So he turned the army of Italy over to Major General Jean Moreau, who was the guy who, decided to go off on his own and abandon Jourdan east of the Rhine a couple of years ago. He was a far more capable general than Scherer, for sure, but we also last saw him charging for glory in 1796 instead of doing the smart thing, which was link up and mass a force, and they probably could have won the war right there against Charles, and it would have been Napoleon's glory, and there we have another great what-if scenario. Scherer primarily lost because he wasn't a good general. But remember how he, at one point in time, was a member of the Austrian army and the Dutch army? Well, that led him to be a very convenient scapegoat. And there were deep suspicions back in Paris that he had turned traitor because of how easily he had lost, and then by how much ground he had just voluntarily given up. We're going to come back to that one. But after taking over the army of Italy, Moreau drew up a heavy defensive position along the Adda River. And the Adda River is the river that is basically right by Milan. This one right here. So Moreau's drawing up a position right along there. If I could get the eraser to work, that'd be great. Thank you very much. Okay. Erase it for me, please. Thank you. Okay. So Moreau draws up his forces in a defensive line along the river that Scherer was probably aiming for, just wasn't the right river, because he needed to protect the capital. Remember, Milan is the capital of the Cisalpine Republic and is the most pro-French of all the cities in Italy. So he had 28,000 men that were concentrated at Cassano. And I believe I have that indicated by that white dot with an arrow pointing to it. That's the whole point where Scherer transitions to Moreau on the map. And that is where the Austrians hit Moreau. Except they were more than just the Austrians when they got there, as the Russians had finally got in and joined the Austrian force. So now it is a combined Russian-Austrian army at Cassano. And this army, per the request of the Austrians, is being led at this point by General Alexander Suvorov. He linked up with the Austrians, basically marching to their north, coming down, and then they combined their forces at Cassano, and this 28,000 man force that Moreau has is now woefully outnumbered. Assuming overall command, Suvorov, now the combined Allied commander, was in charge of about 24,000 Austrians and Russians and various other close support and reserve forces. They attacked Cassano, Moreau holding Cassano at the Ada River on April 27th. And after just one day of pretty hard fighting, where Moreau held his own pretty well, they pushed the French out of Cassano. So Moreau,
Remember to clonk that follow button.
at that point, looks around and says, uh-oh, I'm not going to be able to do anything against this army. I have to get the bulk of my force out of here. But he decides to break off 2,400 of his own men and sends them into Milan to hold the citadel. Now, what a citadel is, people hear that term and they don't know what that is. Cities going back to ancient times had a concentrated bastion in their cities, especially these city-states. Italy especially. This is part of what the early Roman Empire or the Roman Republic was. These cities had these centralized core positions inside their walls, deep inside that were pretty impregnable. And as long as they could be supplied, you could hold a city by holding its citadel for forever. So if you had a city on the sea that it could be resupplied via ship over and over and over, you could hold via the citadel for a long time. So Moreau sent his 2,400-man detachment to go hold the citadel at Milan, in the hope that we could turn this around and get back to Milan, and the gates will open for us because those men holding the citadel will do so. It's basically the overall tactics of siege warfare for almost 2,000 years and beyond. But Suvorov then led the Allied army to Milan on April 19th, but he didn't stay there very long. He just kind of went past. He got the Allied army moving again. He just kept pressing on Moreau, pushing up the Po River and into the Piedmont, where he actually planned to expel the French from Turin and restore the Kingdom of Sardinia. Now remember that Turin is the capital of the area that is the Piedmont, which was controlled by the Kingdom of Sardinia, which Napoleon had basically negotiated we're going to move through here any way we please. Is that okay with you? Or we'll just run ramshot across you. And they all were like, yeah, that's fine. Just don't hurt us, please. But now, look at where we are already. It is the end of April. Very similar timeline to how quickly Napoleon was able to run ramshackle across Italy moving east. Now Suvorov is moving very quickly. It's almost as if he went to someone's playbook and looked at how he did it. He's following that trail back west. They've practically lost all they've gained a month. Well, they got that peninsula that's hanging down there still. We're going to get to that too. Moreau tried to block Suvorov at Marengo, but he was beaten again. Because, as I have stated, Suvorov doesn't lose. He doesn't lose. And on May 26th, because they had advanced very far past Milan and had all the momentum with them, the Allies entered Turin, and Moreau continued to withdraw back south down to Genoa, which is basically Napoleon's springboard starting point to regroup. So Milan is going to fall eventually, because they're now well behind enemy lines, as is that little trickle of all the little French garrisons that Scherer had left. And by the end of the spring in 1799, as we've just gone through, the French are just getting the crap kicked out of them everywhere. Part of this is bad generalship, Scherer especially. Moreau really not so much. He was doing the best he can with what he was handed. I would say that the losses up in Switzerland are a matter of bad circumstances more than a bad strategic decision by Jourdan. The decision after he starts losing is a bad one. But France is losing everything they've gained ever since a man named Napoleon took over the army of Italy very, very, very quickly. So when we come back from our break, we're going to examine how this impacts things back in Paris. Oh my goodness. We thought we were undefeatable French army, according to the directory, is now getting its teeth kicked in all over the place. They didn't heed the warnings of someone named General Jourdan, decided to plunge themselves arrogantly into a war against what at the time was a seriously better combined power. Maybe they just didn't buy into the idea that the Russians were going to show. But now they're in trouble. We're going to look at how all of this affected the directory, because remember when we started talking about the directory, they sit atop a very narrow pillar of support. They've been beating down the left and the right for years, holding on to power. And so long as that single pillar, the army, supported them, they were going to be okay. Well, how do you think an army who is getting the crap kicked out of them at the arrogant insistence of the directory is going to react as we roll into the summer of 1799? We'll talk about that and the upcoming coup of Prairial, which isn't going to go down, I think, like you guys expect it to when we get back. Thanks for hanging out. Again, thanks for the 10 gift subs, Manny. Thanks for the resub, Terry and Gilly. We'll see what happens in Paris as the unrest at home begins to start. And then we'll begin to roll this episode into what is a more shocking coup that occurs in Prairial. And I don't think you guys are going to really, I don't think you guys think you know what's going to happen. So I wouldn't don't base what you think is going to happen on prior coups, because it's not going to be like that. I'll talk to you in a few minutes. Stand up, stretch your legs, get a drink, do all that stuff, but make sure you stand up. We've been sitting for about an hour. I'll be back in a few minutes, and I'll talk to you all soon. Thanks all for being here.
Let's rock!
We're back. Hopefully you're back, because I'm back. So we spent our first section today talking about the poor fortunes of the French army during the spring moving into the summer of 1799. Just in time. Thank you, Dustin. Welcome back to you as well. How the French basically due to bad preliminary logistics, poor decision making, and just maybe in Jourdan's case, a set of unfortunate circumstances. Maybe he would have just backed up as soon as he realized he was outnumbered more than 2-1. It just wasn't going well for the French. They were getting their butt whipped everywhere. But remember the timing here. This was going into the summer. So fortunately for the directorial regime back in Paris, the initial offensive of the war were just being launched around the time that the elections of year 7 were getting underway. So there was still a lot of, we're going to be just fine, as the electoral assemblies came together to vote on who they wanted to send off for the elections. And the defeats in the Swiss plateau and in Italy weren't yet known to the voters when they were going to vote. Unfortunately for the Directory, it didn't matter all that much, as the men who showed up to these primary assemblies to vote and nominate people were decidedly anti-regime anyway. But that's been the case for 3 years. Royalist, leftist, and now again, in year 7, people that really aren't happy with the Directory. Because win or lose this war, it was really safe to say that the people of France weren't happy to be going back to war. Yeah, and the thing is, but they were still at war. Yeah, they were at war, but they were in a naval war, very, very succinctly. They were just dealing with Britain on the seas. There was no continental presence of British forces. So this is really, okay, we're really back at war now that we've decided we are going to declare war. If it had been a defensive war in the mind of the people, maybe their sentiment would have been different. If the Directory had sat back and waited for the Austrians to declare war, then all they could have said was, well, now we're just defending France. But they were the aggressor, and that didn't play very well back at home. Because to most French families, the return to war on the continent meant tax increases, forced requisitioning of troops, and that meant the conscription of their sons again. And that hasn't played well in a lot of places all the times it's been done. But inside the electoral assemblies that were meeting to elect people, the nominees, the anger that was there was not anger at the Directory about the war being restarted, but rather that France was not sufficiently prepared to win this war. So guess who's back in terms of being a political force again? Who wants war? Who is always in favor of the war? French supranationalists have control of these elections, of the Jacobin or even Girondin variety. Now remember, way back in 1792, the Girondins were the saber rattlers, but these two groups both comprise the radical left. The radical left is who shows up for these electoral assemblies in year 7 in 1799. They were very perfectly happy with the aggressive posture that the Directory was taking as the War of the Second Coalition unfolded. But they were really incensed at the Directory because they weren't doing a good enough job to mobilize to win it again. So as the elections of year 7 begin to unfold, before they even know about, there's pretty justified anger, the regime, which is basically Barras, La Revellier, and Roubaix, they were going to lose. Of the 187 sitting candidates up for re-election in year 7, who were endorsed one way or the other by the sitting directorial regime, 121 of 187 were defeated, mostly by men of this neo-Jacobin variety. So, it's time for another coup, you think, right? The Directory is going to do something here. They're going to step in and swat this down in some way, just like they have done in the past couple of years. Well, there's going to be a coup, but it's not going to be the type of coup that you're probably expecting, given this pattern of coups we've observed since the start of the Second Directory. So the Directory goes back to the same bag of tricks. They attempt to employ those same tricks that they had used in the elections of year 6 for the elections of year 7. That is, they sent out agents to stir up fake controversies. They had electors selecting entirely different slates, inventing schisms in the primary assemblies, and as always, railing against this imagined anarchist royalist conspiracy, which really didn't exist, that portended these left-wing candidates wore the white cockade of royalism under their red liberty caps. But this time, the legislative councils were much less interested in backing the directors up. So rather than invalidating the anti-regime candidates, the councils confirmed the anti-regime candidates and let them take their seats. So, oops, maybe they were trying to set up their own kind of coup, but it didn't work out the way that Barras and La Revellier and Rubel were trying to get it done. It spelled big trouble for them. And, you know, Paul Barras, being who he is, he's always been the guy that kind of blew with the wind and knew where to put his feet when the time was right. Well, this is the time where he realizes it's probably, he already has his foot out the door on this as soon as he realizes he's in trouble. Though this was troubling, in the triumvirate's minds at least, it would be okay. Because as we discussed in episode 1.39, when we discussed the coup of Fructidor, the Directory always had the one ally you could count on, right? Yeah, okay, the legislative assemblies aren't doing what we need them to do for us to really retain our power and not have an opposition. But we've got the army. We could always count on the army. As long as the army was with them, they were safe, and that has always been the case. But this was the moment, as the legislative councils were saying, nope, we're going to seat these guys, that the French army was getting beaten by the Austrians and the Russians on every front. And the generals were only too happy to scapegoat the directors for leaving the French armies ill-prepared for the war, just like General Jourdan's report had said. So the army, which had backed the Directory up until this point, is now very happy to say, we're actually getting the snot kicked out of us, and it's these three guys' fault. Well, it's the Directory's fault. They weren't really pointing fingers at names. The scope of the French defeats that we talked about already tonight was becoming known just as the sessions of these new legislative councils convened with their new neo-Jacobin delegates at the end of May 1799. And that new neo-Jacobin opposition was soon in very, very productive talks directly with the generals about overthrowing this triumvirate of power at the top of the Directory. The news only got worse on the frontiers in the opening weeks of this legislative session. So with the Austrians now officially in the war, troops committed fighting with the Russians now officially in the war, committed fighting side by side with the Austrians High Command ordered Archduke Charles to move on the French positions in Switzerland. That's that big red arrow coming down. Now, the Directory had pretty much disbanded that army of the Danube that Jourdan had led into the Black Forest. But they brought around 52,000 men, some from that army, some from reserves, into Switzerland. And at the end of the day, it was about 52,000 men. So about 32,000 men that they brought down on top of the 20,000 men that were in Switzerland. About 52,000 men were garrisoned, not haphazardly, but not as well concentrated as they needed to be. It wasn't just the French. They also had Swiss conscripts there. So Switzerland is being defended by a hodgepodge amalgamation of guys grabbed from everywhere to stack on top of those 20,000 that were already there, and some of those guys were Swiss. This army is led by the most outstanding General André Massena, who is top right on your grid. We've not spent a lot of time on him, but he is really, and we talked about this, and Gilly, you set me up perfectly. We have two anti-Napoleons. Massena's a really good general. He's going to prove himself to be a very good general as we move into Season 2. He was a general of division during Bonaparte's Italian campaign, so he learned by watching Napoleon do everything he did. He was one of those guys moving around as everything was going down in northern Italy. And he will soon become, next season, one of Napoleon's original marshals of France. and he is clearly, of the numerous marshals of France, one of the 2 or 3 best of all of them. He's not going to fare very well here, but that's just a matter of, again, the army is not well prepared. Logistically, it's kind of thrown together, and Massena does what he can do here. He drew up a defensive line in front of Zurich, but he was just simply going to be overwhelmed by 2 Austrian armies, which are now converging on him there. Not Suvorov's force. Another Austrian army was coming into Switzerland. He sent out a strong force to prevent the 2 forces from linking up, because he knew that was death. But that attempt failed, and then on June 4th, the Austrians launched an attack on Massena's defensive line on multiple fronts. And through this first day of fighting, the French were actually able to repel this initial attack from the Austrians. And then on the next day, the 2 sides kind of took a breather and regrouped. That tells you something right there about Massena. He was outnumbered. He had 2 forces pincering him, not behind him, but still pincering down on him. And he was able to hold his own on the first day. Massena decided to pull himself even closer to Zurich, but he recognized that this was not going to end well. Austrian envoys came to him to parley on June 6th, so the day after the first day of fighting, 2 days after the first day of fighting. And Massena looked at the situation and said, yeah, we're going to lose here. I'll pull out from Zurich. I'll bring all these troops out of here and give it to you if you just allow me to keep my force intact and let us retreat with our arms. And Archduke Charles said, that sounds good to me. And he let Massena leave with an intact force, which is important. Massena is going to look like he lost here, but he inherited a situation that was unwinnable, and he did the best he could with that situation. And so the French abandoned Zurich to the Austrians. Just after Massena was pulling out of Zurich, Suvorov down in Italy delivers a crushing defeat to the French in Italy. With the situation in northern Italy going so bad, the French forces in southern Italy were ordered by the Directory to mobilize and all but evacuate the south. Remember, we just talked about how they had to go down there and curb stomp the Kingdom of Naples for trying to kick this whole thing off early. Well, those forces now have to come back north to try to bail out an army that is currently commanded by Moreau. Yeah, you are defeated, sir. Instead, the so-called Army of Naples was soon on its way north in a way that would practically guarantee entire French expulsion from Italy. Suvorov had Moreau in front of him and was well aware that he could not allow this force that was coming up on that blue line toward Lake Trebia to link up with Moreau. So, Suvorov made the very bold decision to kind of let Moreau lick his wounds, left a token force facing him, and turned the entire combined Austrian-Russian force in Italy to go just cut the head off of the army of Naples that was coming up to link up with Moreau. The French forces from the south tried to swing around the Allies by going through the Apennine Mountains, which is, there's a central spine of mountains not on this map that just kind of runs down the middle of the peninsula. And quite honestly, the French probably should have come up the coast, but they didn't. They took a very slower route through the Apennines. And Suvorov took complete advantage of this mistake. On June 18th, Suvorov met the army of the Naples at the Trebia River, which is a southern tributary of the Po River, and was also a site of one of Hannibal's greatest victories against the Romans, because Hannibal, just like Suvorov, is going to take complete advantage of the geography here. In a very different way, I'm not going to get into it, but they both were very good generals, and they realized this is the place. On the first day of fighting, Suvorov's army of about 35,000, now an equal mix of Russians and Austrians, attacked the French line, but they were actually repulsed. The second day of fighting unfolded in reverse, with the army of Naples attacking, but they were in turn also repelled by the Allied army. And across these 2 days, the French were just taking significantly heavier casualties than the Allied army was. The defeat of the army of Naples on day 2 was crushing, and because of it, they were very demoralized, and they fell into retreat on the third day. The total numbers here are disputed a little bit, but of the 35,000 man army of Naples who left Naples, somewhere in the ballpark of 12,000 to 15,000 wound up battle casualties at the Trebia. Suvorov was all set to run right after him, because that's what you do when an army retreats, but when he grasped how badly he had hurt the army of Naples, he looked at it, shrugged his shoulders, and said, that can't hurt me anymore. It was tattered, demoralized, and just broken. And so he let him go, because he didn't really feel any fear of them anymore. And he was right. They couldn't do anything to him anymore. The rump of the defeated French army marched to the west coast of Italy, where Moreau was, and they again tried to regroup with him, north of Genoa, but they just never linked up. And this army just really doesn't get going anywhere else. Suvorov keeps them separate from Moreau. In just about 3 months of disastrous campaigning, the situation in Italy was pretty much back to the place it had been before Bonaparte showed up. The French contained the things down to the crest of the Ligurian Alps. That's that mountain range that kind of runs north of Genoa. The Allies once again held everything else in Italy. The only difference was that the French, for the time being, still had garrisons holding patchworks of citadels in what had now become deep enemy territory, and all of those little places, including Mantua, were under siege. So with the defeats continuing to mount, and more on the way, the political situation in Paris for the triumvirate grew really dire, though it can hardly be called the triumvirate anymore, because the opportunistic wild card Paul Barras, again, already had one foot out the door. He looked around and became convinced that the only way to survive what was coming next was to switch sides. So tonight, we're going to say goodbye to Louis La Revellier, and we're going to say goodbye to Jean Roubel, and Paul Barras changed sides on everybody. I'm actually happy with how I designed that. You're welcome. Then either fate or some sneaky behind-the-scenes maneuvering stepped in to make the death of the triumvirate official.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
Jean-Francois Roubel, who I just deleted from the screen, had his name selected from that magical retirement sorting hat that's, of course, never been fixed. It's always been fair, right? He was the guy that all of a sudden had his name pulled. This guy was the most consistently driven and intelligent of the directors, and his vacancy left a vacuum upon his retirement that was more than just one vacant seat here. And his departure changes the entire political balance inside the directory. Doubly so, because the man who is selected to take Roubel's seat was, wait for it, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, the man who had refused, the man who had refused to join the original class of directors back in 1795 because he hated it and they had listened to him. All of a sudden, Sieyès says, I'll be quite happy to take that seat that's been opened up by the very convenient departure of probably the core member of the triumvirate. You can hopefully see where this is going as we lead into next week, to a degree. Why would Sieyès take this appointment now all of a sudden? Well, stay tuned, because it's all a part of the plan. Now, Sieyès is a guy who we've been talking about since way back before the National Assembly. And he's had a very interesting career since he wrote, remember, he is the guy who wrote, What is the Third Estate? That pamphlet which outlined exactly how the Third Estate should effectively create the National Assembly. It was he wrote it back during his days as a part of the Society of 30 in the lead up to the States General, which we talked about all the way back in episode 1.3. He's been around for that long. If you'll recall from way back then, he was one of the main drivers to push for that unified National Assembly after those Estates General had been convened. Once it had happened, he sat on that first constitutional committee of the National Assembly because, as you can see clearly now, writing these things is kind of a passion for the guy. He was involved in the original draft constitution. He wanted to write the Constitution of Year 3 and pretty much got snubbed. But his influence back then back when the National Assembly was getting going was really undercut. And kind of a reason he kind of flowed out of the picture was because, remember, he is the Abbé Sieyès at that time. He is a Catholic clergyman at that time. And he was against a lot of those early church reforms that were being brought out by the National Assembly. Sieyès did not want to abolish the tithe, remember that happened, and he opposed that original civil constitution of the clergy, which spawned those first civic oaths, again, because he was a member of the clergy. But he bounced back in 1792, and he got elected to the National Convention. Believe it or not, the National Convention started in 1792. I know it feels like it was yesterday, but it convened in 1792. He got elected, and despite his sincerely held belief in constitutional monarchy, he sat at the National Convention's first version of the Constitutional Committee that was supposed to be drawing up that first Republican Constitution for France because the king was dead. But, if you recall, that first committee of the National Convention was that Girondin Committee that was expunged and replaced by the efforts of Louis de Saint-Just and the Jacobins, who came in and said, we can't trust anything these guys did. So after the Mountain took control of the National Convention following the purge of the Girondins, Sieyès was pretty much forever suspect because he had been involved with their writing of the Constitution, even though he wasn't really one of them, but he'll survive. Because, to avoid the fate of so many of his friends and colleagues from the good old days of 1789 at the hands of the Committee of Public Safety, he chose at this time to renounce his faith during that great de-Christianization run over the winter of 1793-1794, which we had talked about all the way back in episode 1.28. It wasn't until the Thermidorian reaction that Sieyès finally relaxed, and he was asked what he did during the Great Terror, and he famously replied, I lived. After Thermidor, Sieyès returned to public life, and he was a lead negotiator in the Treaty of The Hague, which set up the Batavian Republic up in the Netherlands, if you recall. So now, having regained his reputation and a measure of his prestige, he then tried to play a major role in the crafting of the Constitution of Year 3, which created the Directory, but again, most of his suggestions were ignored. Bitter over this slight, that nothing he was proposing was getting listened to, when he was supposed to be one of the original 5 directors, he declined, and that's how Lazare Carnot got that seat. So then when the legislative councils decided to tap him, they decided to tap him. Nothing about that was prearranged or part of any plan that's kind of been going on in the background for a while. He agreed to serve. He said, yeah, I'll be a director now. His opinion of the Constitution of Year 3 has not changed at all. That's probably why he wants to be a director right now. Because now's a pretty good time to get in and bring the whole thing crashing down, which is going to happen next episode. Sieyès had lately been serving as ambassador to Prussia, so it was not until June 9th, after he got tapped, hey, you're the new director, okay. He came back from Berlin to Paris, and after that, things moved really quickly. So quickly, in fact, that it's almost impossible to believe what comes next hadn't been worked out in advance. Paul Barras, for example, having played a major role in getting Sieyès elected, the two of them are about to team up to purge all the other directors and form a whole new government. Now, they're not going to form that whole new government until we start talking about that new government at the start of Season 2. That's the consulate. But here he is, Sieyès and Barras, working together, now that they're both directors, to get rid of all the other directors, and they're going to pivot into an entirely new form of government, which is what Sieyès and, I don't know, Talleyrand have wanted the whole time. So to start down this path, I will begin with a refresher course on who the 5 directors were prior to me deleting the yellow box. The summer of 1799, before Sieyès takes his seat. We had La Revellier, that remaining, actually, as I got rid of Rubel. So you have La Revellier, the staunch remaining triumvirate member who had been there since day 1 of the Directory. Then you have, hey, look at that, I can't sync my changes. Thanks, that's good though. Then you have Paul Barras, also a director from day 1, who right now is in the process of, he's already abandoned Rebelle, he's going to abandon La Reveille as well. The other two members who you've probably forgotten about and are not on the board were Philippe Antoine Merlin de Douai, who was appointed in the wake of the Fructidor coup, and Jean-Baptiste Traillard, who was the guy who served as that belligerent French ambassador at the opening of the Second Congress of Restat, and then who had been elected a director in the wake of the coup of Floreal. The newest member was, of course, Sieyès, who had just taken Rebelle's seat. Everybody I just mentioned, not named Sieyès or Barras, is about to get the boot. Just before Sieyès arrived in Paris, the Council of 500 demanded the Directory produce a full report on the military situation of the war. Who was supplying the army? Where was the money going? How had conscription been proceeding? Why are we getting beat so bad? Were all demands that the council made to the Directory. The assumption here on behalf of the councils was that there was so much graft, corruption, and war profiteering going on that any report that comes back from the directors on army logistics was sure to fatally compromise the directors. And the Council of 500 was still waiting for this report on June 16th, 1799, aka 28 Prairial, year 7. And they declared themselves in permanent session. Remember those days? Until the directors produced this report and accounted for themselves. The Council of Ancients watched the Council of 500 declare themselves in permanent session, meaning we're open for business 24/7. They followed their lead, and now with both chambers of the French legislature in permanent open session, the coup of Prairial was on. And the Directory isn't going to lead it. Sure, Barras is going to weasel his way into surviving, but the rest of them aren't. Late on that same day, in the evening of 16 June 1799, right after all the Directory's remaining friends in both councils had gone to bed, those new anti-regime Jacobin delegates opened up a full broadside because they could, because both of these chambers were still in session. And as long as there was a quorum of individuals there to pass things, they could pass things. Remember, that's how the Declaration of the Rights of Man got going. The Council of 500 declared that there were irregularities with Traillard's election as a director after Floreal and demanded he be expelled from the Directory at once. Council of Ancients said, that sounds good, and they concurred with that. When that demand then landed on the Directory's desk, La Reveille said, we're not going to go along with this, right? And that's when Sieyès and Paul Barras looked at him and said, nah, I think we should. And that's the moment that La Reveille realized that Barras had abandoned him. Abandoned this political alliance which had run the Directory for the past 2 years. So feeling isolated and not a little bit concerned for his personal safety before things got ugly, Traillard did agree to resign. And he was replaced by Louis-Jérôme Goyer, who is the middle guy top row now. He was an old Jacobin who, wait for it, had been Minister of Justice from March 1793 to March 1794. And those of you who keep good notes know that those days are right smack dab in the middle of the Reign of Terror. He was the French Minister of Justice as the heads were rolling at their most extreme extent. He's your new director. The very next day, 30 Prairial on the Republican calendar in June 18, 1799, to you and me, the Council of 500 then turned on La Reveille, Merlin, and de Douai, accusing the three of them of corruption, misappropriation of state funds, treasonous mismanagement of the war. The councils demanded that all three of them immediately resign. This is crazy, right? Because Paul Barras has been the guy in charge, and somehow he is not being brought up in this wave. It's almost, again, like it was pre-planned who was going to survive this. That maybe Barras could deal with the councils before any of this went down, saying, hey, we'll do everything you want as long as you leave me and CS and whoever else you pick, in charge. Somehow, exactly. Now, Merlin de Douai and La Revellier initially resisted this call. But then a parade of delegates coming at them basically convinced them it was in their best interest physically to resign. No one wants bloodshed, right? And this was an actual veiled threat. Like, if you don't resign, you're dead. Merlin de Douai cracked first and tendered his resignation. And then La Revellier looked around and said, yeah, I want to live. And he followed suit very shortly thereafter. Barras and Sayes then suggested worthy replacements, and wouldn't you know, the council just went right along with who Barras and Sayes picked. The new directors were Pierre-Roger Ducos, who I have on the board, who was an old regicide from the National Convention, and then an obscure Jacobin general, but was a staunch Jacobin, no picture really available, which is why he's not up there, named Jean-François Auguste Moulin. With the replacement of the three directors, it not only looked like the coup of Prairial, which was still kind of orchestrated by one of the directors, just not the triumvirate that you probably expected to execute the coup. It looked like it was complete and a total victory. But it was also a victory for the left. Remember that Barras and his triumvirate kind of sat in the middle. But remember also who just won the election. He had to... Remember, there was an opposition here that Barras and Sayes were compromising with and dealing with. It was a very leftist Jacobin cabal. So we're going to take another quick break here, because now the directory is reshuffled. But the directors, the new directors of Goyer, Ducos, Sayes, Barras, and Moulin, it's really Barras and Sayes at this point that you really need to be concerned about. The rest of these guys aren't going to matter. Barras and Sayes are looking at this going, hey, we got done what we wanted to get done. But they kind of, for a moment, misjudge this plan that they have. And it is a plan. Talleyrand, Sayes, Barras, and Bonaparte's in on it as well at this point. They got what they wanted. But they also misstepped for a moment. We're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about them kind of recognizing they don't have the power that they think they have, which is going to lead them to move quickly. And how they begin, what is that mistake and how it manifests. We're going to get into the plan, the actual plan to destroy the directory next week. But we're going to extrapolate on the thing that makes them go, hit the gas pedal right now, please, when we come back from a break. So hopefully you guys are enjoying this as we wind down the end of everything that we've watched be built up and destroyed and built up and destroyed and built up and destroyed and built up and about to be destroyed over the past 44 episodes. Because it's all about to land in the lap of a man named Napoleon Bonaparte in a week. We'll be back in a few minutes. Make sure you stand up. Again, get a drink, go to the bathroom, all that stuff. But stretch your legs. We'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you all for being here tonight. We got a little bit more to go as we bring this thing in for a landing. We'll get to the quiz. And then we'll set it all up for next week in the thrilling conclusion of the French Revolution on Fiction's Heavy Metal History. Thanks all for being here. I'll talk to you in a few minutes. Let's go. Get back in your seats. Recess is over. So before we took our last break, we talked about how the coup of Prairial was not a coup that was started entirely from the top down. And those top-down coups, while unique in history, had only really occurred in these last 2 years prior to year 7. How this coup was more orchestrated in a flanked sort of way, where Barras certainly was involved, and he had CS in the mix before CS was declared director. But it was this new cabal of neo-Jacobin delegates who decided to cooperate with Barras to get rid of Rebelle, La Reveille, Merlin de Douai. And they walked away. Barras and CS, the new directory, walked away feeling pretty good that they had won the coup of Prairial, that it was a total victory for them. But the problem was that it was also a victory for the left. And after the council kind of re-separated from the directory, the new directory, their interests weren't aligned anymore. They were aligned for a moment, and then they weren't anymore. For a while, in the wake of this coup of reshuffling, it sure looked like a new revolutionary government was on the way. Now, I mean revolutionary government in like the Committee of Public Safety days, revolutionary government, where a constitutional-less government was on its way. Because right away, the reshuffled directory decided to reshuffle the entire ministerial cabinet. Because Goyer and Ducos and Moulin are not part of some political alliance with Barras and CS. A dangerous group of goofballs. I wouldn't call them goofballs. They were serious. But this new directory decides, and they say, hey, okay, Goyer, Ducos, and Moulin were all really Jacobin guys. They looked at Barras and CS and said, we're going to get rid of some of your men, some of the triumvirate men that were part of your ministry, because they're part of the problem too. This included Talleyrand, who loses his job at this point as foreign minister. Don't worry, he'll be back soon. But they started to put men sympathetic to Jacobinism in the place of, thank you very much, rice burner out my window. They started to put Jacobin ministers in the place of triumvirate men like Talleyrand, one of which was Talleyrand's replacement, General Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte. And anybody that knows Napoleonic history should know that name. He was an accomplished and very enlightened general who will go on in Season 2 to have a famously stormy relationship with Napoleon. Like Massena, Bernadotte will become one of the original marshals of France. Down the road, he's going to end up King of Sweden in 1810. After Bernadotte becomes King of Sweden, he's actually going to ally Sweden against Napoleon. I know, spoilers, called foreshadowing, Dustin. Here's the thing. Bernadotte, who becomes foreign minister of France in the summer of 1799, becomes King of Sweden in 1810. The current modern-day royal family of Sweden is descended from him. We're going to cover his life in much more detail in Season 2. You're not wrong, Turi. It's going to get wilder in Season 2 in some aspects. Not so much the... Let's say it this way. France is going to be a very stable political body for about 10 years in Season 2. Everywhere else, maybe not so much. The newly left-leaning legislative councils then proceeded to reinstate freedom of the press, which had been suspended, if you recall, after the coup of Fructidor. Then they also lifted the ban on political clubs, which soon led to the formation of yet another neo-Jacobin club called the Menage Club, as it took up its residence in the Menage of the Tuileries Palace. And this leads me to a thing I never mentioned, that in the past, the National Convention moved out of the Menage, that building that was that horse pen that had been so central in your mental picture of everything. They moved out of there in 1794. But this building, the Menage, had served as the home of the National Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, and the National Convention, but it had been vacated right about the time of the Committee of Public Safety, you know, starting to chop everyone's heads off in early 1794. The Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients moved into parts of what is actually the Palais Bourbon when they got to work. And after all these years, even since the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients moved into the Palais Bourbon, it's actually still the current home of the lower chamber of the French legislature today, which, wait for it, is called the National Assembly. It still meets to this day in a refurbished Palais Bourbon, which is where the Directory's legislative councils were meeting after they abandoned the Menage. But this new Jacobin club, it's not called the Jacobin Club because they knew better than to call themselves that. They called themselves the Menage Club because they said, hey, they moved out, we'll move in. So at the end of June, once news of the loss of Zurich and the crushing defeat of the army of Naples, that's when it became known. General Jourdan, now feeling much better and once again retaking his seat in the Council of 500, declared a new levee en masse happen. And he wasn't wrong. Jourdan, I lost in the field, but you have to look back at what he's done over the past year and go, he's been pretty right on the mark about everything that France needs to do. All eligible, I don't know why I have a frog in my throat, but all eligible conscripts, anybody who was identified under the Jourdan law, it's not going to be called up in lots anymore. You're coming up now. The economy of France is going to, again, revert to everything that Lazare Carnot had made it to do. Completely and wholly dedicate itself to the war effort. So this is going to help somebody else who comes along to take control of this, maybe as he's on his way back to Egypt. Aggressive domestic requisitioning would recommence at once, as would the demands of the government on the very wealthy of those forced loans again. The high point for neo-Jacobinism came in July 1799, so it's pretty short-lived. When the councils,
remember to clonk that follow button.
When the councils passed what is known as the Law of Hostages. That sounds very Jacobin-like. The law said that if the government declared a department to be, quote, disturbed by domestic unrest, that family members of men deemed to be responsible for that disturbance could be arrested and held as hostages. Those hostages would then be held liable for any damages caused by civil unrest of the people they were associated with. This law of hostages was directed almost entirely at the families of emigres and other nobles who they believed were, causing trouble, because guess who the Jacobins were going to target? Anybody that was still remaining of the aristocracy and any emigres who had come back to France. So this is in fact looking like we are going back to the radical left-wing Jacobin nationalism of 1793, which led to everybody getting their heads chopped off. Then the leftists in the councils decided that not only purging the old directors would be enough. And on July 14th, 1799, that is the 10th anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, and the day on which Bonaparte whipped the Turks outside Alexandria on his way outside of Egypt, the councils indicted for corruption and treason Rubel, La Revellier, Merlin de Douai, Traillard, and General Barthélemy Scherer. Because, of course, he's going to get scapegoated for everything that went bad in Italy. This is the moment when the new Jacobinism in the legislative councils are now just targeting their enemies. They're going after people for no good reason. And by the way, how is Paul Barras not on that list? He was Rubel and La Revellier's buddy for 2 years. How is he not on that list? But somehow he's not. But this renewed neo-Jacobin near bloodlust for their enemies, which ramped up really quickly as soon as they had power again. It's swinging in a direction that Sieyès and Barras go, we can't have this going on. So while the indictments were debated throughout the summer, Sieyès, Barras, Talleyrand working in the background, they really didn't organize their reaction to all of this, but they took the plan they had kind of on the shelf, still being worked out, to bring the Directory down, and they put it into motion. That is what we're going to get into next week. The zenith of this neo-Jacobin power at home in France coincided with the lowest point for the French army's fortune abroad. This is the low point of everything. So it's not that bad in the grand scheme. They're going to have a bad spring and summer. With the French armies in Italy broken and bottled up in Liguria, every French-held fortress and citadel that was still out there on the peninsula just started capitulating. They just started falling like dominoes because they were completely isolated. They had no hope of resupply. They were completely surrounded. So they just started falling. The Milan garrison surrendered finally on May 24th, and the Turin garrison surrendered on June 20th. When the army of Naples had departed for the north, the small garrison that was left behind in Naples, they were immediately attacked, and they surrendered on June 15th. And those were just the main cities. All those men holding out, all those little Italian forts everywhere. They just looked around and said, "What are we doing?" And they surrendered. Then came the ultimate kicker for everything in France. After a 4-month siege, the fortress city of Mantua fell to the Allies at the end of July 1799. That was the last of the major places to fall, and it meant that by the end of July 1799, very completely and entirely, everything, everywhere that Napoleon had done in Italy was completely undone. The Army of Italy attempted to reverse the situation in mid-August with Moreau having failed to salvage the situation, then two being replaced by a guy named Barthélemy Catherine Joubert. I don't have him on the map or on the board because he's not going to live that long. Joubert was 30 years old and at the time possessed immense talent. He was one of those guys that if he had lived would have definitely been one of Napoleon's marshals. He had been elevated very rapidly by Bonaparte during the campaigns in Italy in 1796 and 1797. Joubert had about 35,000 men at his disposal, and he arrayed them around the city of Novi, up in some high ground that looked down onto the Piedmont, and guarded the entrances into the Ligurian Alps. So he was basically defending the mountain passes against any Allied advance down toward Genoa. This was also where Napoleon had begun his own spectacular campaigns plunging into Italy proper. Joubert planned to strike out from this position near Novi and win back what had been lost. He was basically going to try to replicate what Napoleon did. And he really didn't expect Suvorov to come down into the mountains and attack him. But then suddenly on August 15th, that's exactly what Suvorov did, with about 50,000 men. So he outnumbered him by 15,000. The French managed to hold out at Novi under Joubert all day against successive waves of Russians and Austrians, and it was of all the campaigns in this year in Italy, this was probably the bloodiest. But as night fell, the French had taken enough of a beating that their lines finally began to crack. And cracked so badly that Joubert's army was split in two, and they had to fall into a really bloody fighting retreat, fighting back down from the mountaintops, back down toward Genoa. This was the very last toehold in Italy for the French. And Joubert himself, who was probably one of the best and most promising of the young French generals that would have flourished not even a year or two from now, was killed during this bloody fighting retreat. Suvorov looked down and was really set on finally evicting the French completely from Italy. Like this last little piece down in Liguria, down south of the Ligurian Alps, right along the coast. He was like, yep, this is it. We're going to kick them out of Italy completely. And then he got frustrating new orders. The Austrian High Command had decided to not pursue the French army of Italy any further until Switzerland was completely and firmly in Allied hands. Now, Massena had retreated, but that wasn't the end of French everything in Switzerland. They ordered the Austrian High Command, the Allied High Command, ordered Suvorov to turn his back on Liguria and march north into Switzerland. This is the mistake. This is a fatal blunder. It's not Suvorov's error. He followed his orders. But it will set up a complete reversal of Allied fortunes in the fall of 1799 as we pivot into our last episode of the season. These reversals, this decision to not allow Suvorov to finish off Italy, it will end with the Austrians and the Russians ready to kill each other, just as willing as they were to kill the French. The Russians, for everything they've done really quickly here, are not going to be long for this second coalition, just like the Austrians were afraid of. But next episode, in our grand finale of Season 1, we will begin with a quick swing across all the frontiers, as the seemingly inexorable Allied advance that we've discussed this episode will suddenly be turned back. But we're not going to spend too much time on that, because we're going to get into that in Season 2 as well, because the second coalition is going to spawn over the break. We were going to have to go back to Paris to mark the end of the line for Season 1 of the French and our coverage of what is the French Revolution. Because back in Paris, Sieyès and Barras will organize that reaction to this ascendant neo-Jacobinism, which will culminate in the coup of 18 Brumaire, which will topple the Directory, pave the way for the consulate, and then eventually the French Empire under Napoleon. As we will see in our finale, Bonaparte will be the principal benefactor of the coup of 18 Brumaire. But he's also the one who nearly blows the whole thing before it even gets off the ground. And that's it for the eve of the finale, episode 1.44 of Season 1 of Fixer's Heavy Metal History. I almost can't believe it. It feels like it's been going on for so long that it's sad for it to end. Here's the thing though, Gilly. It's not like we're, it's like a TV show that's been greenlit for 2 more seasons for real, because there's enough stuff going on here that I will be easily take you to the Council or the Treaty of Vienna, which will end everything around Napoleon. We'll take our break there again. We'll go into the Bourbon Restoration, which, remember those guys? The Comte de Provence, the Comte d'Artois, they're both going to be kings of France. And then that Bourbon Restoration will be short-lived when, remember, Duc d'Orléans, the new one, guy who crossed the lines and then came back, he's going to be king of France too. That's Season 3. It's something you should be super proud of. It's an amazing body of work you produce. I'm not anywhere near done. Nowhere near done. The 4th season will be interesting, and then I need to figure out how I want to treat getting into World War I. Do I want to do it very quickly, or do I want to take my time? But we're going to be with France for another 2 seasons. Those seasons will be shorter than this season. There will not be another 45-episode season, hopefully, until we get to World War I. There's no point in that. There's no need to get into this level of detail. But you will still learn things and understand things better than you probably do. I do appreciate the sentiment, though. It's been a ride. We can do a lot more of the sentimentality over the end of the season next week. But what we have here first is we have a quiz to do. So hopefully you've enjoyed tonight's episode. We have to go through our quiz at the end. It is exclamation point answer to answer the question. Do not use the word boy or fix with 2 X's in your answer. And participation has been up the last couple weeks, and I really appreciate that, especially as we circle this thing in for its ending. Take a educated stab at it. Take your best shot. All it helps me do is figure out, did I convey points accurately? This was a confusing as hell episode to do. Try to piece it all together and stitch it together in a way that made sense and kept everything moving narratively. Next week will be a whole lot easier, because it's just like, this is the one thing that's happening pretty much. But the quiz and your feedback and your attempts to answer it helps me make sure that I've gotten the point across. So with that said, off to the quiz we go, and our first question. Your first question tonight. Once I fix yet another typo, because I typed these in Notepad, what was the initial factor that complicated Jourdan's chances of success once he crossed into the Swiss plateau? Berlin is in. Berlin, who has gone 10 for 10 the last 3 weeks, I think. Gilly is in. I'm going to make fun of that answer, Gilly. 25 seconds left. With a very redundant, exactly. That's what I'm going to make fun of. I'm just looking for bodies. Manny is in. Turi is in. 10 seconds left. Time is up. Let's go to the first answer from Berlin. I know it's right. Mud and fog. Yep. Muddy ground made it really impossible to maneuver, and the fog made it impossible for Jourdan to see how big Archduke Charles's army was. That is correct. Look at that, Berlin. Mads is not here to ride your coattails tonight. The next answer, coming from Gilly, is the mud and early spring fog of the spring, which happened to be in the spring, as it happens sometimes in the spring, that mud and fog happen in the spring sometimes in the spring. Gilly gets it. The next answer comes to us from Manny, mud and fog, correct. Just true. Turi says muddy terrain. That is one of the two factors. My question says the initial factor. It was singular on purpose. I will take that. Mud and fog. Yes.
Well, it's about tree fitting.
The next question. He was just going around. For those of you that don't get the joke, I was just looking for bodies. We played Among Us for like 5 hours last night, and Gilly, who was an imposter, when questioned what he was doing, said, I was just going around looking for bodies. And everyone was like, well, you're definitely the imposter. It was pretty funny. The next question. What interesting strategic decision did Jourdan make after his defeat at Stuttgart? Basically, what does Jourdan do after Stuttgart that we talked about? Gilly is in. Turi is in. Berlin is in with 20 seconds left. Well, get it in before the timer runs out, Doc, because that's the answer. You're on the phone. We'll give Doc the answer. He came in before the buzzer. No one else answered after him, so we'll give Doc that point because it didn't compromise anything. But just try to make sure you get the answer in there. Yes, he decided to go back into the Black Forest, northwest, away from Switzerland. Instead of, going back to where there was a bastion of 20,000 men waiting to back him up in Switzerland. I believe, personally, it was Jourdan saying, I've had enough of this. Because he had been, with good reason, against the war because he felt that the French army was not in a good state. And then he had just had to demonstrate it to himself that the French army was not in a good state. The next answer comes to us from Gilly. Retreated to the Black Forest instead of trying to link up with Moreau. Not Moreau. He wasn't trying to link up with Moreau. Moreau wasn't actually in charge of the army of Italy yet. It was still Scherer. But the retreated to the Black Forest part is right. So I will give it to you. But Moreau was not in charge yet. No worries, Doc. I know on phone the exclamation point doesn't mean anything. He did not rejoin other French forces from Turi. That's correct. In Switzerland. Berlin, I think, is the next answer. He went northwest in the Black Forest and back to meet up with the 20,000 army still south. That is correct. That is the very correct answer. The next question is, during General Scherer's three-pronged approach toward Verona. What occurred which forced his army into retreat? Didn't take yours? Manny, I'll look. Yep, Manny, I see it. He went to the Black Forest. I'll give you that point. I'm sorry, it came in, and I didn't see it. Manny's answer, I can see it in the bot. He went to the Black Forest. That is correct. So let's give that to Manny in sequence on the next time around. Sorry, I didn't see it, my friend. I think I saw 3 seconds and then didn't pay attention after that. It's my bad. We'll get you that point as soon as the timer's down, because it'll mess things up if I do it in the middle. During General Shearer's three-pronged approach toward Verona, what occurred which forced his army into retreat? Berlin is in, Gilly is in, 20 seconds left. Dr. Death is in. Time is up. First things first, we'll give Manny his point from the last round that I missed. And then we'll take our first answer. Manny goes a 5. Next one for this question. The Austrians and Russians showed up. No, that is not it, Berlin. The Russians didn't show up until the army was at Milan. Remember, Shearer tried a three-prong approach to go into 3 different cities around Verona. And then later on, he tried to advance with a much more spread out army without a reserve, and his right flank got detached from himself due to being spread out so bad. Oh, okay, blame me, that's fine. The streak ends because it is the detachment of that right wing that collapsed basically his own flank that caused him to retreat all the way to Milan effectively, and that's when the Russians showed up. The response from our next contestant: he spread out his forces too far and the Austrians were able to cut his line in half. That is pretty much the answer, yes. Gilly gets it. The next answer, if there is one, I believe, is from Doc. Draw in Verona and the defeat in the south. That is what happened. But the tactical thing is the split of his army. That was what I was looking for. My answer, he was too spread out, and his advancing right wing was cut off from the rest of his army. That's what I wrote in my answer. So Gilly gets it. I don't think we have any more. It's the end of valid answer. We're going to double check, make sure I don't miss anybody. We don't. Okay. Then we get into the next thing, which I just talked about. I'm just messing with you, Berlin. After his defeat at Verona, what questionable decision did Shearer make? Apparently me talking messes up Berlin. So maybe I'll just talk the whole time to mess up Berlin. Keep saying his name because I know it really throws Berlin off. But after his defeat at Verona, what questionable decision did Shearer make?
My lord?
Go yourself.
Interesting that did not delete. I see it. It's there. I don't know why that's deleted. Maybe it wants an answer. It's there. I see it, Berlin. I'm going to delete it. There it is. Thank you very much. I saw it. It's right. Don't know why it didn't pick up.
My lord.
There.
Yourself.
Oh, that's why he said fixing the message. That is why. All right, the first answer comes to us from Berlin. No, Gilly. He retreated 100 miles to Cassano, effectively ceding a large swath of land to the Austrians. Yeah, he didn't fall back to the nearest defensible river. He basically went all the way back to the Ada, which is right next to Milan. And that just gave up everything to the Austrians, including Mantua. Again, my fault. Gilly gets it right. Berlin, I know your answer's not in there, but his answer was retreated too far all the way back to Milan rather than screw you fix, holding at the river. Doc says he retreated to Milan, effectively giving up 150-ish miles of territory. Milan, Cassano, same difference to me. They're close enough. You got the general idea. He retreated close enough. He retreated far too far back toward Milan. That's good enough for me, Doc. Because I didn't mention Cassano until after Moreau was in charge. Any more answers? Don't think so. We'll double check. All right, the next question. Man, I typoed every single question tonight. What was the sentiment of the everyday French citizen as France returned to a wide land war in 1799? Turi is in. Gilly is in with 25 seconds left. Berlin is in. 15 seconds left. All right. The sentiment of the everyday French citizen as France returned to a wide land war in 1799. The first answer from Gilly, they were not happy. That is basically the answer, to be returning to war, when it was not a defensive war, fearing a return of higher taxes and conscription. That's pretty much the answer. Why the hell are we fighting this war? Why are we the aggressors in this war? It's a political blunder more than anything else. The war was coming. Turi, higher taxes, conscripted sons, they did not like it. Correct. The next answer comes from, I believe, Berlin. They had already been through so much recent war, and even though they had been in a naval war with Britain, they were not happy about being in a full-blown land war and having to pay tax again and give up sons. Yes. Gave the Gilly answer. Anybody else? I don't think so. The next question will be this. Once I spell check it. Within the electoral assemblies for the elections of year 7, what was the frame of mind of those who were in opposition to the directorial regime? What the frame of mind? What was the frame of mind of those who were in opposition to the directorial regime? Within the electoral assemblies for the elections of year 7, what was the frame of mind of those who were in opposition
Remember
to
clonk that follow button.
Thanks, Perm. In opposition to the directorial regime, we have Gilly and Berlin in. Gilly, they wanted to hold the directory accountable for the failures of the French army abroad. The wording of the question confuses me. What was the frame of mind of those who were spawning up their candidates to be elected in year 7? My answer, anger that the Directory had launched a war they were not adequately prepared to win. But they wanted to hold the Directory accountable for the failures of the French army abroad. That is the answer. They weren't mad about the war. They were mad that they weren't doing well in the war. Or that the army wasn't ready for the war. But you got it. The next answer. They needed to be gone. All the current issues and failures were their fault. Nah, it's not specific enough. It has to do specifically with the war. That the Directory decided to launch a war before they were ready to launch a war. That was the problem. I mean, what? The specific point has to do with war failures. Failures of war effort. That's really where the problem is. So, the next question. That's all we've talked about. Well, I'll go back to my notes. And bring the note in if you want me to read it, because I derived it directly from what I said. Where are we here? Let's see. It is up here. Inside the electoral assemblies themselves, most of the anger at the Directory was not that they had restarted a war, but rather that they were not sufficiently prepared to win it. The next question. What was the major political difference the Directory was facing during the elections of Year 7 as they planned to deal a blow to their opposition? Still amazes me what people freaking stream educational under. I know where we're gonna go. What was the major political difference the Directory was facing during the elections of Year 7 as they planned to deal a blow to their opposition? There's a couple of ways you can go with this. There are a couple of major things. We got two answers in right around the buzzer. I'll take both of them. Gilly, the directorial assemblies were wise to their plans from Year 6 and instead confirmed the delegates and allowed them to take their seats. That is correct. That is one of the things. The bigger thing is they didn't have the support of the army. Remember, the neo-Jacobin delegates were already conspiring with the army to get rid of the directors. That was the other part. They lost their main pillar. But that is also an accurate answer. The Gilius. The next response, I believe, maybe hit after the buzzer. Nope. Yep, it did. Berlin's in. The propaganda and tactics were not going to work this time. They didn't have the backing of the army. I will take that. They'll type so furiously, angrily at me next time, and maybe you'll get all the words and the actual answer, but I will take it, Berlin. The next question is... The Coup of Prairial is different than the other prior to in what significant way other than Sayes's election? Basically, describe the way the Coup of Prairial was different than prior to. You get anywhere near the ball on this one, I'll give it to you. Berlin, Gilly, you're in. The answers. It was not top-down. It started more laterally orchestrated. Yes, my answer is this directory was not strong-arming the councils into getting what they wanted. It was the other way around, and they had help from the inside in Baran and CS. Yes, I did say it very much laterally. A flanking type coup. That is correct. Gilly's answer. It wasn't a coup from the top. It was a more lateral coup, reshuffling the directory and ministries from within. Correct. The next question is this. Who were the ultimate victors of the Coup of Prairial? Manny has teamed up with Gilly. We'll get a point if Gilly gets it correct. Gilly is in with 20 seconds. Berlin is in. As the timer runs down, leaving us with one question left. The answer from Gilly, Jacobins, the neo-Jacobins, but yes, the leftist radicals. They are the big winners of the coup of Prairial. Berlin. The leftist Jacobins, Jourdan, he was right, I'll take that, yes, but the leftist Jacobins is correct. Anybody else? I don't think so. Man, the person I want to raid just went BRB. I know. It's still correct. I mean, Jourdan was right the whole time. It came back and got the levy en masse going again. Good thing that Carnot had left that blueprint for him. This one, the last question, is a wide open stage setting question. Oh, don't forget to point to Manny. Thank you very much. All right, the last question of the night is a little bit more open-ended. By mid-August 1799, describe both the political and military situation for France. Because it's important that you understand it before we go into next week. By mid-August 1799, described both the political and military situation for France. I should have said as of mid-August, but you get the point. 10 seconds left. Berlin is in. I will take answers after the fact. I know this is a longer answer. The 10th question usually does require a little bit of leeway. Gilly's in. Was now. You spell checking on me after the fact? All right. Effectively, here's the situation. Neo-Jacobins have a little bit of a headwind in the government, but Baron-CS recognize this. They don't like these new hostage laws and some of these bounties that are effectively going out against some of the prior directors. They really don't like. They're like, oh, that looks like the Committee of Public Safety. Let's do something about this. And they're getting ready to do something about it. France is beginning its butt kicked everywhere. Switzerland, Italy. But Suvorov is ordered to not pursue them into Liguria, and that's the critical mistake. If you walk away with those 2 points, then you are very firmly set for where we will be next week. The first answer comes from Berlin. Political structure had been totally upended, was now more focused previously on previous army stand-up, and the army was now fully supported again. Yeah, the army is fully supported again with the levy en masse. Let's take a little bit of time to get that rolling. Political structure had been completely upended. That's not false. Give you the answer. But again, neo-Jacobinism causing CS and Barras to do their thing with Talleyrand and Napoleon is the big political thing. Militarily, it's about that. Oh, you didn't finish him off in Italy, huh? Berlin, take the point. The next answer comes to us from Gilly. The government of France is essentially rotting from within, and its armies are being devastated abroad. In my opinion, France is ready for collapse. If nobody were to say sweep in and take charge of things. That is a fair answer. All right. That is the quiz for tonight. I don't think we have any other answers. I'll double check. That's the end of the answers there. Nobody at the end there. And nobody on a further button press. So we will go back over here. We're going to raid tonight someone I've never seen before. But I clicked into the educational tab. And they are what looks to be somewhat of a chess prodigy. And I like to see if I can... If I don't have someone to raid, I would like to... He's just stepped away again, damn it. He's a young kid. He is a kid. He is playing 8 hours of chess with his viewers. He is competing in the World Open in 12 days. He looks young, under 10. So we're going to head over there. Basically say, hey, thanks for doing something cool on Twitch. His name is Jude NC. So, I've never sat with him before, but he's playing chess. He's got his viewers watching his matches. He's got his digital board up on the screen. He's got a wall of trophies behind him. So we're going to go over there and hang out with him. And, so hang out with him. We like chess, but at least, say hi when you get there. He seems to really be engaged and enjoying his viewership. But we're going to get out of here. Next Saturday, the finale of Season 1. We get to the Coup of 18 Brumaire, and like I said, I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger because you guys really aren't going to know what the consulate looks like. You have to come back in August for that. But again, thank you all for being here tonight. Thanks for the participation, and I am going to take us out and over to Jude NYC. So again, really appreciate your time and attention. It's been a ride. One more to go until this thing comes to a close and French Revolution's in the past, and we turn to the Napoleonic
My lord,
Empire.
go yourself!
Off we go. Don't forget to follow my good friend, Dustin. He streams Monday through Friday, 7:30 a.m. to 10:30 p.m. I don't know what he's playing next week. There's my good friend Permanent, who should be back from his vacation. I don't know if it'll be Minecraft, but it will be at 10 a.m. on Monday morning, running until about 10:30 a.m., 10 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. or 1 p.m. 10 to 1. That's the time. Then there's Gilly, was playing Among Us with us last night. Probably back to streaming tomorrow night, I think. Happy birthday, my friend, as well to you and to Rocket and to Sparky, who all celebrated birthdays in the past few days. Then there is Intent Rocket streaming whenever she wants, whenever she can. She was last playing The Last of Us Part 2. She was with us tonight for a little while. Hopefully she's doing okay. And then my good friend CF Live, who has been hampered by his internet of late, but streaming off his cell phone to still bring music to you. Hopefully that internet is fixed by next week, but if not, he'll be back with more music, especially on Wednesdays and Fridays. Then Mr. Glenn Diggity, who was streaming today, building a zoo, still streams some music. Good, great friend helped us out with some music. We're out of here. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you all later.
Be excellent to each other.